On the evening of July 1, 1863, the Union Army coiled itself around the ridges and knolls south of the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. Men by the tens of thousands lay upon the hard ground that night, their muskets stacked in the moonlight, their thoughts uneasy. The fields that had sprouted corn and wheat now bristled with bayonets. At one end of the line, on the rocky wooded slopes of Little Round Top, stood Colonel Joshua Chamberlain in the 20th Maine. History has rightly enshrined their charge as the salvation of the left flank. The granite of that hill, the downward swing of bayonets, and the desperate rush against Alabamians are known in every telling of the battle. But on the far opposite end of the field there was another anchor. Here, on the tangled, forested slopes of Culp's Hill, Colonel David Ireland of the 137th New York held the extreme right of the Union Army. His regiment, stretched perilously thin, no more than a single man deep across its works, faced not one assault but hour after hour of pounding, relentless fire. Their stand lacked the clean drama of a bayonet charge. Instead, it was a test of endurance, of blood soaking into the soil beneath breastworks, hastily thrown together from logs and stones. The fate of the Union line rested as surely upon Ireland's shoulders as upon Chamberlain's. If the 20th Maine had bent, the rebel tide would have swept around the Union's left. If the 137th New York had given way, Ewell's men, the remnants of Stonewall Jackson's division, would have burst through the right, rolled the Union rear, and perhaps shattered the army entire. This is the story of David Ireland and his New Yorkers, how they marched into the gathering storm, how they dug, fought, bled, and held their ground through night and dawn, until the thunder at Gettysburg passed. Their tale is written in the smoke and fire of Culp's Hill, a story less spoken than that of Little Round Top, but no less vital to the salvation of the Union. The sun of July 1st bore down with merciless heat, and the dust of the Pennsylvania roads clung to every face and sleeve. We had left the little hamlet of two taverns that afternoon, the 137th New York marching in column, our canteens near empty, our mouths tasting of grit. The sounds of battle floated ahead of us, carried on the sultry air, the distant cracking of rifles, the muffled boom of cannon, and the faint cries of men. Each step forward pressed us closer to that storm. As we neared Gettysburg, the road curved and orders sent us to the left. The town lay hidden behind ridges and orchard lines, but the rising smoke told its own story. We were sent not into the heart of the fight, but to the edge of it, to the far left of our army's line. There we halted, forming column of divisions, and sent a company forward as skirmishers, their blue coats vanishing into the shadows of trees and fences. The rest of us stood at the ready, muskets in hand, watching the lowering sky and listening to the roll of battle like thunder just beyond the hills. At last we pressed forward, half a mile perhaps, until we reached the brow of a rise. The ground fell away before us into fields cut by stone walls and hedges now trampled by men unseen. It was here, upon that crest, that we were ordered to remain for the night. No fires were kindled, for the enemy was near. The men lay on their arms, some leaning against their knapsacks, others dropping where they stood, too weary to speak. The twilight brought little comfort, the air hung heavy with powder smoke drifting from the town. Sleep came fitfully, if at all. A soldier would close his eyes only to start awake at the crack of a rifle or the rumble of distant artillery. Murmurs ran through the ranks, questions of where Lee's host lay, of how soon the attack would come. The officers moved quietly among the men, speaking low words of encouragement, though their own faces betrayed the same unease. It was in that uneasy darkness, stretched upon the crest of a hill outside Gettysburg, that we waited. We did not know then that the next 2 days would write our regiment's name into the nation's history. We knew only that the enemy was near, that the morrow would bring blood, and that each man must be ready when the dawn called us forward. The dawn of July 2nd found us stiff and hollow-eyed, yet still in our places upon the hill. Before the sun was well up, orders came to shift. We rose, fell into line, and marched from the left toward the right of the army. The road to Gettysburg ran close beside us, wagons and columns moving with a ceaseless rattle and tramp, the air thick with the dust of 10,000 feet. We halted at length on a ridge parallel to the road, a position that looked out over tangled woods and ravines. Here we were set to work. Axes rang sharp against oak and chestnut, men straining to fell trunks and drag them forward. Bayonets and tin plates dug into the stubborn earth, tearing up sod to heap against the logs. The sweat of every man ran in rivulets, soaking collars and darkening belts, while the July sun glared overhead. Yet there was no complaint, for each man knew what the labor meant. These breastworks were not idle exercise, they were the frail wall between life and death. By noon the line was complete. Logs were piled shoulder-high, earth banked thick against their base, loopholes left for musket barrels to thrust through. Behind this rude fortress, the regiment took its station. The men threw themselves down, some panting as if from a long march, others wiping powder-blackened hands though no shot had yet been fired. The breastworks seemed strong, but in every mind lurked the same thought: when the storm broke, would they be strong enough? All through the hot hours of the afternoon we lay behind our works, the air heavy with the drone of insects, the far-off mutter of cannon rolling from other parts of the field. Now and then a courier clattered by, or a puff of smoke rose from the distant lines, but still we waited, the tension growing like a weight upon the chest. The men spoke in low voices, some jesting darkly, others silent, staring at the timber wall as if measuring how much it could stand. Toward evening, as the shadows lengthened, word came down the line: skirmishers forward. Company H was called, Captain Berrager leading his men into the thickets ahead. Their figures vanished into the gloom of the woods, and silence fell once more over the breastworks. The rest of us shouldered arms and prepared to shift again, for new orders had come. We were to leave our stout line and occupy works farther on, built by General Kane's brigade. When we reached them, a chill passed through the ranks. The line was thin as a thread, so thin that we must stand one man deep to fill it. To the right there was nothing at all, only empty air and open woods. Every man knew what that meant. If the enemy came in force, they would sweep around that flank and strike us from behind. Yet there was no choice. We took our posts, muskets resting on the rough logs, eyes peering into the gathering dusk. The July sun was sinking, the air turning red with its last light, when the first faint rattle of musketry drifted back from the skirmishers. Then through the trees we glimpsed them, gray lines moving forward, not one but three, sweeping toward us like waves of the sea. The storm we had long expected was upon us. The evening air grew heavy as the enemy advanced, their muskets flashing in the dark timber, their voices raised in a long, rolling yell. Our skirmishers came running back through the brush, their fire quick and sharp, but the gray tide pressed on. We waited behind our shallow works, one thin line of blue stretched across the slope, each man with his finger tight upon the trigger. Then the crash came. 3 lines of Confederates bore down upon us, their volleys striking like hail against the logs. The air filled with the hiss of lead, the whine of splinters, the sharp cries of the struck. Our men answered shot for shot, a blaze of fire leaping from the breastworks, smoke boiling up until the woods were wrapped in choking darkness. On the right the peril grew swift and terrible. There was no protection there, nothing but open ground, and already the enemy were swinging to turn us. I ordered Company A to bend at right angles to the line facing the flank. They wheeled sharply and poured their fire into the advancing column, checking it for a moment. But the numbers were too great, and soon they were pressed back, fighting yard by yard until they found firmer ground where they could hold. Reinforcements came. 1 regiment of the 1st Corps hurried forward under the guidance of Lieutenant Canteen. I placed them upon that exposed flank, and for a heartbeat it seemed we might yet secure it. But their stay was short, for the storm was too fierce. They fell back in disorder, leaving the ground open once more. Now the fire struck us from 3 directions, to the front, to the right, and from a stone wall in our rear the enemy's bullets poured in, and men dropped fast along the line. The air was a tumult of musketry, the woods echoing with the ceaseless roar, the shouts of officers, the cries of the wounded. We fought on, holding as best we could, the regiment shrinking with every passing minute. At last I gave the order to fall back to the line of the 3rd Brigade where stronger work stood. The men withdrew by companies, still firing as they went, and there we formed again, extending the works to cover our front. The enemy pressed close, but here for the moment we held them. It was in that desperate hour that Captain Gregg, with a handful of men, charged straight into the foe who harassed us most. With bayonet lowered he rushed them, shouting, his voice clear above the storm. He fell, mortally wounded, even as his men drove the enemy back. His courage burned bright in the darkness, and the memory of it stayed with us all. Night came down upon the hill, and still the musketry rattled. Smoke hung low among the trees, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the sound of axes and shovels as new lines were strengthened in the gloom. The fight for Culp's Hill had only begun, and the cost was already heavy. The night of July 2nd was no night at all, but a black furnace of fire and noise. Darkness lay upon the woods of Culp's Hill, yet the hill itself glared with musket flashes, each discharge lighting the faces of men strained with sweat and powder. The smoke hung so thick that even the stars above seemed blotted out. We fired by the blaze of the enemy's rifles, by the brief flare of our own, the line so close that every volley struck with deadly certainty. We had fallen back to the works of the 3rd Brigade, where the timbers rose stronger and the ground gave us some shelter. There we clung like shipwrecked men to a spar, the gray sea breaking against us again and again. Our numbers had thinned, the regiment scarce more than a shadow of itself, yet each man fought with the ferocity of 10. Muskets grew hot to the touch, barrels fouled so that balls rammed home only with savage blows of the butt. Still the men loaded, fired, and cursed the foe who would not yield. From 3 sides the enemy's bullets poured in. They struck the logs before us, they whined over our heads, they cut down branches that crashed upon the line. Behind us, the stone wall that should have been our refuge became instead a perch for rebels firing into our backs. Men dropped where they knelt, some with a word, some with a groan, others in silence, their hands still clutching ramrods or cartridge boxes. In the midst of it, courage shone bright as any flame. Captain Williams moved calm along the line, speaking to the men, steadying their fire, until a ball struck him down. Lieutenant Van Emberg, our acting adjutant, strode openly through the storm, cheering, rallying, fearless to the last, until he too fell. Each death was like a blow upon the heart, yet the line did not break. And there was Captain Gregg. With scarcely more than a squad at his back, he charged bayonets into the very teeth of the foe that tormented us from cover. His voice rang clear, his sword flashing in the night, until he pitched forward, struck mortally even as his men drove the enemy from their ground. He gave his life as a beacon for us all, and none who saw it will forget. At length, relief came. Colonel Fowler, with the 14th New York, and General Kane with the 2nd Brigade, pressed in upon our flank, their fresh ranks filling the gaps where ours had worn thin. We pulled back into their rear, our bodies numb, our ears ringing with the endless crack of rifles. Behind their sturdier line we sank down at last, the fight still raging, but the weight no longer ours to bear. So we passed the night, sprawled upon the earth, muskets still in reach, eyes half closed yet never fully sleeping. The forest glowed red with the steady flashes, the air heavy with powder smoke, the cries of wounded men piercing the dark. It was a night without stars, without rest, and it seemed without end. The morning of July 3rd broke not with birdsong or gentle light, but with a rebel yell that tore through the gray woods before the sun had even risen. At 3 o'clock we moved forward again, relieving the 147th New York in the breastworks. The men sank behind the logs, their faces haggard from the long night, their eyes heavy but burning with resolve. Some wiped the dew from their muskets, others checked cartridge boxes with hands that trembled from fatigue. None had more than a mouthful of rest, yet all knew what waited in the shadows. At 4 o'clock, as the first pale rim of dawn spread across the eastern sky, the enemy came. They burst from the trees with a wild, shrill cry, their volleys flashing red in the half-light. The woods themselves seemed to catch fire, each tree and stone leaping into sight with every discharge, then vanishing back into smoke and darkness. Our men answered in kind, the regiment alive with flame, the recoil of 100 muskets thundering in unison. For nearly 2 hours the storm raged without pause. Powder smoke rolled thick as a fog, stinging eyes, burning throats, choking breath. Men fired blind into the haze, loading by instinct, ramming home cartridges with bleeding hands, their knuckles raw from striking fouled barrels. Splinters flew from the breastworks with every hit, cutting faces and tearing uniforms. Bullets hummed like angry bees, and the cries of the wounded rose in chorus with the unceasing roar. It was then that a strange and grim sight came upon us. Out from the swirling smoke stumbled a body of gray-clad men, 52 in number, throwing down their muskets, their hands raised in surrender. Captain Silas Pearson stepped forward, his voice sharp above the din, and ordered them to the rear. They passed by with hollow eyes, muttering that they were of Jackson's old division, the Stonewall men themselves. So it was these veterans we had held at bay, Men who had broken armies before, now checked by a single New York regiment standing one man deep. Still the fight did not slacken. The enemy came again, and each time we hurled them back with volleys that shook the earth. At last, near 6 o'clock, the relief came. The 29th Ohio, Captain Hayes commanding, swept into our works in splendid style. We staggered back, our faces blackened, our mouths dry as ashes, our limbs quivering from the strain. Some men dropped where they stood, falling into sleep as sudden as death. Others simply stared, dazed, at the smoldering woods that had swallowed so many of our number. Thus the dawn of Independence Day's Eve was baptized in blood and smoke. We had held, but the cost had only begun to be reckoned. When the fire slackened at last, we pulled back from the breastworks and sank into the dirt like men who had marched 100 miles. The morning sun rose hot and merciless above the trees, glinting off bayonets and casting long shafts of light through the smoke that still drifted in heavy banks across the slope. Some men fell into a stupor at once, their muskets clutched tight against their chests as if even in sleep they dared not let them go. Others coughed black powder from their lungs, their faces streaked with grime and sweat, their eyes hollow and rimmed with red. But the rest was short-lived. Orders rang out, and once more we were called forward to relieve the Ohio regiments who had taken our place. So it went, hour after hour, rotation upon rotation, the weary trudging back into the works, the crouch behind logs already scarred and splintered by countless shots, the endless rhythm of loading and firing, then stumbling back again to collapse in whatever patch of ground lay behind. It was war by attrition, measured not by grand charges but by the ceaseless grind of men worn thin. Each relief brought its own trial. The enemy still pressed us, though with less fury than at dawn, and every return to the works meant more smoke in the lungs, more blood upon the ground, more comrades carried to the rear. The hill itself seemed alive with noise, the crack and roll of musketry, the shouts of officers, the groans of the stricken. Even in the lulls, silence never truly fell, only the low murmur of men shifting, cleaning fouled barrels, whispering the names of those who no longer answered at roll call. By afternoon the men had grown almost insensible, their movements mechanical, their minds dulled by exhaustion. Powder had blackened their lips, and their eyes stared with a glassy brightness that spoke of bodies pushed past human limits. Yet still they obeyed, still they held, as if bound by some iron cord that would not let them falter. As night closed in, we once more entered the line, relieving the 5th Ohio. The darkness was thick beneath the canopy of trees, broken only by the glow of occasional musket flashes. At 1 in the morning they came to relieve us in turn, and we staggered back through the gloom. The ground was littered with shattered branches and silent forms, the air heavy with the smell of burnt powder and blood. So ended the 3rd day of July for the 137th New York. We had not yet seen the last of battle, but already the regiment bore the look of men who had endured a lifetime in a single day. The 4th of July dawned gray and still upon Culp's Hill. For the first time in 2 days the woods were quiet, broken only by the rustle of leaves stirred by a soft morning breeze. No rebel yell split the air, no musket crack echoed through the timber. The silence itself felt strange, as if the earth held its breath after so long a storm. The men rose stiff from the ground, their uniforms stiff with sweat and powder, their faces gaunt and blackened. They moved slowly, like old men, though most were scarcely past 20. Some knelt by the brook to drink, the cool water washing soot from their lips. Others sat in silence, cleaning their muskets for the 100th time, though no order had yet been given. Habit and fear drove the work as much as discipline. It was the nation's birthday, but there was little cheer upon that hill. We had seen too much death in the dark hours just past. The names of the fallen hung heavy in the air. Gregg, Williams, Van Ember, Hallett, and so many others whose bodies now lay among the trees. The regiment was thinned to a shadow of itself, ranks ragged, companies broken. Where once men had stood shoulder to shoulder, there were now gaps that no one would ever fill again. Yet pride mingled with grief. We had faced Stonewall Jackson's old division and held them fast. The ground before our works was littered with enemy dead, mute testimony to the fury of their assaults and the steadiness of our defense. We knew that, had we broken, the whole right of the Union line might have been swept away. The thought stiffened weary spines, for we understood that in our endurance lay part of the salvation of the army itself. The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist, and the silence deepened. It was not the peace of home, but the uneasy calm of a field that had drunk its fill of blood. The men spoke little. Some scratched notes to be sent home with couriers, Others stared long at the empty places where their comrades should have been. The hill seemed haunted by their voices, each tree and stone bearing witness to the struggle of the past nights. Thus Independence Day of 1863 came to us on Culp's Hill, not with parades or music, but with silence, sorrow, and the knowledge of what had been bought at such terrible cost. As the day wore on, the full measure of our ordeal became clear. Roll call was sounded, the sergeants' voices carrying down the battered line, and too often the answer was silence. Names once spoken with easy familiarity, men who had marched with us from New York, who had shared rations and jokes on the long road south, were called into the stillness and answered only by memory. 38 were dead, 86 wounded, and more still unaccounted for. The regiment, once proud in its numbers, now stood thinned as if a scythe had passed through it. The wounded were gathered in the rear, some borne on stretchers, others stumbling with the help of comrades. Their faces were gray, their uniforms dark with blood, their voices low but steady. A few spoke of home, others of the fight, their eyes still blazing with the fury of the night before. In their courage there was no complaint, only the grim satisfaction that they had done their part. Among the officers the loss was keenly felt. Captain Gregg, who had led that gallant charge into the teeth of the enemy, lay dying, his last breath spent in urging his men forward. Captain Williams had fallen at his post, his calm words of steadiness still echoing in the ears of those who heard them. Lieutenant Van Emberg, our acting adjutant, had been everywhere at once, fearless, his voice carrying above the musketry until he fell cheering the men. Lieutenant Hallett had met his end the same way, doing his duty to the last. Their courage stood as a monument higher than stone, a memory that no roll of drums or flourish of banners could surpass. So it was that the regiment counted its losses on the 4th of July, the day of the nation's birth. Where others celebrated independence with bells and fireworks, we marked it with silence and graves. Yet in that silence there was pride, for we knew we had held fast when the army most needed us. The right of the Union line had bent but never broke, and in that stubborn stand the fate of the battle had been secured. History would remember the clash on the rocky hill to the south, where Chamberlain and the 20th Maine flung themselves forward in a desperate bayonet charge. Their valor was undeniable, and their name has been carried in song and story ever since. Yet on the opposite end of the line, in the dark woods of Culp's Hill, another stand was made, no less vital, no less desperate, and born not in a single rush, but in the long, grinding agony of 2 nights and a morning. Colonel David Ireland and the 137th New York held their ground when the flank was open, when the enemy came in 3 lines, when fire poured upon them from every side. They held when comrades fell in heaps, when their right hung naked in the air, when the weight of Stonewall's old division pressed upon them like a hammer upon an anvil. They bent, staggered, bled, but they did not break. It is easy for the world to remember the charge, the shout, the sweeping drama of men rushing down a hill with steel gleaming in the sun. Harder to remember is the slow heroism of men standing to their works in darkness, choking on smoke, loading fouled muskets with trembling hands, watching friend after friend collapse beside them, and still firing into the storm. Yet it was this endurance, as much as the flash of bayonets on Little Round Top, that saved the Union at Gettysburg. Ireland himself would not live to see the end of the war. He fell in service the next year, his life cut short as so many of his men's had been. But his name endures in the roll of those who gave the nation its second birth. His regiment, the 137th New York, wrote its testament in blood on the slopes of Culp's Hill. So when we speak of Gettysburg, let us remember not only the charge of Chamberlain, but also the long night of Ireland, where a single thin line of New Yorkers, scarcely 1 man deep, held the far right of the Union Army. In that steadfastness lay the salvation of the field, and with it, the fate of a nation.